Hello, folks. I am excited to be back. This is a topic that I enjoy quite a bit. Um, so I hope that you also find this a fun topic. We're talking, of course, about eschatology, the Catholic understanding of eschatology. Eschatology is a Greek word, or comes from the Greek anyway, the eschaton. And the eschaton means the end of things or the end of time. So if you think about this, the end things, I had a priest professor who was a Benedictine monk when I was working on my undergrad, and he liked to use the term bovine eschatology. So just go ahead and pause the video and think about that for a second if you need to. What we have in front of us here is a triptych detailing the end of time. Triptych, as the name suggests, it's a lot like a comic strip, really. It's a 3-part image. And this was a really popular form of art during the Renaissance. You can see that it looks like a cabinet and there are some hinges on there. So it does close. And you'll see these like on altar pieces, the front of the altar and things like that. So we have Christ sitting above the world in judgment on the firmament. You can see that it's Christ crucified. You can see the holes in his feet. He is surrounded by, we've got the lily, but you also have a sword and you have a crown of thorns next to the sword. You have the cross and the pillar where he would have been whipped. You've got the apostles around him. And I don't know if that's supposed to be Mary of Magdala or if it's Mary, the mother of God. You have Saint Michael underneath him judging or weighing the souls of the resurrected. And you can see demons dragging people into hell on our right, but Christ's left. And St. Peter welcoming people into heaven on our left, which is Christ's right. And if you look at Christ's hands, you can even see him. He's directing them, and he's got that hand of blessing up with his right hand. You might remember in the gospel, Jesus saying, he would sit in judgment and separate the sheep from the goats, with the goats being on his left. Long time ago, I used to run D Hall, and we let some guys for some guys it was makeup time, for other guys it was detention hall. And I would make the D Hall guys who just had to stare at the wall sit on the left side of the crucifix, and I would call them goats. Always catechizing. So when Tina and Deacon Dan first asked me to give this talk a few years ago, I thought about where I would start. And I think, of course, you have to have life to have death. The traditional way of talking about Catholic eschatology is probably to start off with what we call the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. But I thought, what if we went to the root? Like, why? Why do we as Christians believe that there is death? And I spent a lot of time during graduate school studying John Paul II's Man and Woman, He Created Them, A Theology of the Body. And there's this great book by a woman named Mary Healy, Healy. It's not very long, maybe 130, 140 pages, very accessible. It's called Men and Women Are from Eden. The older of us will remember a very popular relationship book back in the late 80s called Women Are from Venus and Men Are from Mars. Ms. Healy says men and women are both from Eden. And in that story, in that book, she talks about the repercussions of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And she argues that there are five ruptures that occur as consequences of Adam's and Eve's decisions to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And of course, the Bible does not tell us what the fruit is. If you ever wondered why we say apple, in Latin, we speak of the malo malum. Malum, which means bad apple. So it's kind of a pun. And that seems to be where we get the idea of the TKGE, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, being an apple tree. The first rupture to occur is concupiscence. And, if you are a parent, you probably get this joke. Dory is somewhat absent-minded, and so she'll forget things almost immediately. And concupiscence is a word coined by St. Augustine of Hippo. It's Latin. That con means with, and then the root word is cupiditatis, which is the same word as Cupid. It's the origin of Cupid. So it means desire, right? And we use the word concupiscence to refer to that inclination that we experience to give in to temptation. Okay? And what Healy argues, and she's not alone, is that prior to eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, human beings would not have experienced concupiscence. We would not experience a struggle to avoid temptation. We would easily choose the right. And this is something to consider too, is the concept of freedom. A modern conception of freedom is the ability to do what I want when I want. And if you impose restrictions on me or suggest there are consequences, then you're somehow imposing upon my freedom. For example, when my children were younger, I would take them to the rocket slide in Burns Park, and there was a sign up there that says, don't climb up the slide and don't slide down with a child in your lap. And I'll usually use that as an example to my students about freedom, because I could argue that it's inhibiting my freedom. Who are you to tell me I cannot go down this slide with my toddler on my lap? But then, of course, we work out that it could be very detrimental to my toddler. What if he put his foot down and the weight of my weight, inertia continued, and then he's injured, right? And you want to talk about inhibiting freedom. Classical freedom is the ability, or classical understanding of freedom, is the ability to choose the good. You may have heard the old saying, first things first. Well, everything has two purposes.
Attention, please. Chase Doman to the front office. Chase Doman to the front office, please.
The secondary purpose is usually pleasure. The purpose of food is to sustain ourselves. The secondary purpose is pleasure. If we put second things first, we become unhealthy. If we keep first things first, we can enjoy our food and feel, strong and healthy. I have to teach a different topic now. I'll be back. Okay. And we're back. We were talking about the first rupture that occurs because of the fall of Adam and Eve. But let's move on to the second. The second rupture of original sin is divine fatherhood. Now, what we mean by that is that we lose our trust in our divine Father. So that relationship between God and human beings is broken. When I talk about with my students, what I'll normally talk about is how when we're of a certain age, we just have absolute faith that our parents will take care of everything. And we have absolute trust in our parents. And then, and we don't hide anything, right? We'll even joke about how, especially when they're really little, 2 or 3 years old, there's naked time, right? The kids take the bath and they run around. It's free as a bird. And Adam and Eve, of course, had naked time as well. They were naked without shame. But after they ate from the apple, they recognized what they had done, and they hid themselves when they heard God coming. So that relationship between us and God is ruptured in original sin. Partnership is also ruptured. And by this, what I mean is human relationships. Primarily emphasized in Genesis is, of course, the relationship between the man and the woman. That this relationship is now going to be a struggle, and they may have differing aims or goals. Of course, that's going to go to other human relationships as well. The fourth rupture is toil. Now, what I mean by this is it's clear from Genesis that human beings are created to work. We are created in the image of God. And what God does is he creates, he works. And we even see, if you read Genesis 2, when Adam is first created, now before there's Adam and Eve, so we just have, we have the Hadam, that Hebrew word for human, with no suggestion of masculinity or femininity yet, grammatically. God tells Adam to tend and to protect the garden, or to care for it and to cultivate it. So Adam is supposed to grow the garden. He's supposed to protect the garden, and he's supposed to grow the garden. Bishop Barron will say that Adam's job as priest, God's first priest on earth, was actually to extend paradise throughout all of earth. And this was going to be done without toil, just as God labors but doesn't toil, if you will. And God says that because of the fall, man will now work the soil by the sweat of his brow, and woman will give birth in pain. Right? So labor, both giving birth and the work that we do, now becomes toilsome and tedious. So what you have, of course, is just this whole idea that all of these things which should work just very fluidly, work together, they don't anymore. Now, the fifth rupture, the greatest rupture that occurs because of original sin, is death. And what you'll learn if you read that book by Mary Healy is the greatest thing that a human being can do, that which makes us most human, that fulfills our purpose, is to worship God. That's the same purpose that the angels have. It's the purpose that all of creation has, is to worship God. And, not because God needs us to worship him for like some kind of self-inflation, but rather when we worship God, we're properly oriented and giving thanks where thanks is due and recognizing God's role in holding everything together. Death renders us incapable of doing that. Now, say it's a rupture, and it's a rupture between the body and the soul. Now, most of us in our culture, we grow up thinking of the body as almost like a prison, right? People die, and we say they've ascended to heaven and they're in a better place and all of this. There's this interesting thing. So there's a Catholic philosopher named Peter Kreeft. He's a teacher at Boston College, or at least he was. It's Kreeft. He is considered by many to be the modern C.S. Lewis for Catholics. I think he tends to be a bit more philosophical and a bit less fairy story than Lewis. And both approaches are fantastic, of course. But anyway, Peter Kreeft points out in a book that he wrote called The Philosophy According to the Lord of the Rings, or Philosophy According to Tolkien. Yeah, so he uses J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis to explain philosophy. That, we have a tendency to be afraid of ghosts and to be afraid of dead bodies, zombies, or just a dead body. And he argues that seems to be maybe a reflection that we recognize that neither ghosts nor dead bodies are the way things are supposed to be. It is Plato who said the body was the prison for the soul. Biblically, the body is much more important. The Bible is sacramental. in its understanding of the body. And what that means is that the body is a visible thing that makes an invisible reality present or manifest to us. My body allows me to create this slideshow and to hit record. My body allows me to speak. Your body allows you to pause me and go get a cup of tea. If we were in the same room together, our bodies would allow us to interact. We could shake hands. We could high five. I joke with my, Catholic High for a long time did not have air conditioning. So I used to joke with them if I were teaching this in August or May that, it allows us to high five, to talk, to hear each other. If someone forgets to wear deodorant, we could smell each other. Though the body's sacramental. The body is how we do anything. And Kraft says that without the body, the soul is paralyzed. You can't do anything. And that includes the idea that it can't worship. So sin not only leads to, but is death. It is the separation from God, of which physical disintegration is only the outward sign. For the ancient Hebrews, death means I cannot praise God because I am cut off from communion with the very author of life. So here's the interesting thing. Banishment from Eden is therefore a kindness. Eden without death, but after eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is hell on earth. Humanity beyond the hope of redemption because of the infinite separation from God. So sin simply is death. It's that separation from God, and death is the physical or outward indication of my separation from him. And again, how is it a kindness? It gives us a chance to be redeemed. It forces us to think about it. The Hebrews talked about Sheol, right? So this is where you go when you die. Now, what I've grabbed here, you can actually kind of see where those angels are coming down in the upper left. You can see the Greek characters there, and it says Lazarus. Okay? And you notice that he's a poor man. And it looks like the angels are actually taking his soul out of his body. And then there he is on the right, seated with Father Abraham. Okay, and then the lower left, we have a rich man who's lying on a sumptuous bed with servants. And the demons, there's a demon pulling his soul out, and he's carried to hell. And we can see him actually calling up to Father Abraham. Now, basically nothing happens in Sheol. I'm going to get back to this story. Sheol is a place where basically nothing happened because nobody has a body, right? We know that there's some kind of living. Now, it's down. Like hell is a word that sometimes gets used there. So there is the idea of down, of the underworld, just like other religions of the time. It's still kind of better than other religions. The Sumerian religion, when a person died, he descended into the house of ash, where he slaved for the gods until he simply ceased to exist. By comparison, Sheol doesn't seem that bad. When Saul goes to the witch of Endor to conjure Samuel's shade, Samuel just seems angry. Why are you bothering me? You're not supposed to be doing this. Sometimes Scripture will use the word Hades or hell for both Sheol and the Hell of Torment. That we'll turn to in just a moment with words that the Bible normally uses for that. There are, whether it's Hades or hell, there is this idea of there being two shades, that is to say, two places, kind of an upper and a lower. Okay, so the idea is that because of sin, all men have to die. So when we pray, for example, the Apostles' Creed, we will actually say that Jesus descended into hell. If you've ever seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, then you have this idea there as well of, at Christ's death, the Satan figure recognizing it from hell that there's something different about him. We also have this thing that we call the harrowing of hell. Harrowing means annoying, or in this case, the emptying. And so the idea is that because he is man, Jesus descends into hell like all other human beings. But he empties it. Now, if we're using this image on the right, he's not emptying the hell of torment. He's emptying the upper level, the bosom of Abraham, if you will, from Luke chapter 17, right? Now, that story, of course, works only if there are two places in the underworld. I want to consider this. So the harrowing of hell is when Jesus empties hell of all those people who are redeemed by the crucifixion, right? So those people who went to hell, not because like the rich man, they were bad, but because they were simply human. Hell, then, in the broadest terms, means a lack of unity with God. As a matter of fact, it's going to mean a complete solitude even from God. Okay? Heaven is really a cipher for union with God. It's important to remember that heaven doesn't begin for me when I die. Rather, heaven begins for me the moment that I choose to follow Christ each day and each moment of each day. Once I choose to follow Christ and give myself over to him, then there's no earthly power that has control over me. Now, of course, earthly powers could hurt me, but they don't control me. I'm free of them. Now, where am I going with this? If heaven is a cipher for unity with God, and hell is a cipher for complete disunity and even solitude from God, then Jesus dies because he is a human. And because he is a human, he dies. When he dies, he descends into hell, that total lack of union with God. And yet, because he is God, he actually brings unity to God to all of the shades in hell. They are no longer in hell, they are in God's presence. And in that way, Jesus empties hell. And that is called the harrowing of hell. But let's talk about the hell of torment. Here the Bible does use hell, it will use Hades. It also uses these terms. So it uses Tartarus and Gehenna, right? Tartarus is the same word that is used in Greek mythology. And so, obviously it just means a place of punishment. Now, the idea, of course, and we get this from Deuteronomy 30, chapter 30, verse 15, there's a choice between God and the self. And if you choose the self, then you're choosing isolation from God, and you go into this hell of torment. And Jesus will often refer to it as Gehenna. Okay? And you can see in my parentheses here, that word is formed from this Gehenna, or the Valley of Hinnom. And Gehenna was this valley that was outside Jerusalem. It was used really as a place for refuse. So it was a landfill, right? And they would burn their refuse. So it's really a great image for the Hell of Torment, because it assaults all of the senses. It's uncomfortable. It smells bad. Your eyes would sting. The sound of all these things burning would fill your ears. So it's a really great all-inclusive suggestion of the isolation and the torment of hell, especially when you consider what makes hell truly hell is the fact that it's never ending. Now, I also have Dante's Satan. I've got that as number 3. That, of course, does not show up in Scripture. And the image I have here is the image of Satan in Dante. Now, if you've not read the Inferno, the idea is that as Satan fell, the earth actually pulled away. It didn't want to be associated with him. And then he winds up crash landing in this lake at the very center of the earth. Now, he stands up and he starts to flap his wings to get out. But his wings are so large as a seraph that the flapping actually freezes the water that he's standing in. And you can kind of see that in this image. So he's stuck. So he flaps harder to try to get out. And of course, it just freezes the water even more. Now, the idea of that is that hell is self-inflicted. God does not damn anybody to hell. We choose that path ourselves. And choice is something that we're going to see as we run to the conclusion of this presentation. Just as Satan, in his pride, trying to save himself, really just winds up getting himself stuck more. Now, if you're curious about the image and you haven't read Dante, you see that Satan has 3 faces, and that's a mockery of the Trinity. But his mouths, ironically, are useless for speaking any word, as God the Father speaks the word that is Jesus. And each mouth is stuffed with one of the 3 men whom Dante believed to be the worst sinners ever to have lived, Brutus and Cassius, and they are head out. And the unfortunate soul who is head first in Satan's middle mouth is Judas. Purgatory is a teaching that a lot of Christians, including Catholics, are confused about or don't know very much about, which is understandable because there's really not that much there. Now, most of us who know a little bit of history, we know that Purgatory was at the center of the initial moves for Reformation because of the way that the idea of indulgences were being abused. But what we should talk about first is what are the biblical bits of evidence for Purgatory? Okay, you can see I've got them written down there. In Matthew, Jesus says, "You will not be released from prison until you pay the last penny." Prison was a slang word, basically slang for Hades at the time. So there's already the suggestion that there must be some kind of redemption that it can occur or does occur, some kind of purification that occurs after death. By the way, Catholics are not alone in this. We are the only ones using the word purgatory, but we shouldn't think of purgatory as a place, but a process. Okay, so I often think of it, or I'll explain it to my students as you're going on a vacation, like you're going to New York City, which is awesome because it's New York City. But you've got a layover in Detroit, which, sucks because it's Detroit. Purgatory is more like a layover, if you will, on the way to heaven. It's not a third possible destination. And, if you know the story of Hamlet, for example, that ghost claims to be from Purgatory. And if it is indeed Hamlet's father and he is in purgatory, then he is saved, which means that his word is trustworthy, since purgatory is, again, on the way. 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter, Paul says that on the day a person will be saved, but only through fire. He'll even use the word purified or cleansed. Jews have what they call the mourner's Kaddish, which is prayer for the dead. The Orthodox Christians will pray for the dead. Muslims will pray for the dead. So we see that it's very common. And the strongest biblical proof text is number 3 here from Maccabees, which Martin Luther removed from Protestant Old Testaments. In this story, Judas Maccabeus finds that a bunch of his soldiers were wearing amulets sacred to the idol at Jamnia. And he thinks this is maybe why they died, like their death was a result of their idolatry. So he takes all of those golden amulets and he has them sent to the temple as an expiatory offering for the dead. And so all of these men, like he's praying for these men in that way. So that's, showing us this biblical precedent, even in the Old Testament, for praying for the dead in the hopes that their sins will be forgiven. Now, again, what we have to focus on here with purgatory is purification, right? There's some kind of process after death that helps to cleanse us. One of the best ways that I've heard purgatory described is actually by C.S. Lewis. And he does this in 2 basic ways, okay? One way is talking about, being invited to a great wedding. And you go to the wedding, you knock on the door, and you were invited straight from laboring in the fields. So you knock on the door, and the owner of the mansion opens the door, and he welcomes you in. And C.S. Lewis says, and then you look down, and, because you look inside, and it's beautiful. There's a sumptuous feast, and this man is, immaculately dressed, and he smiles, and you look at his clean floors, and you look down, and you realize, there's mud all over your boots, your knees are grass stained, you're sweaty, you smell bad. And I say, sir, thank you for inviting me. Please let me go cleanse myself first. Oh no, come in, it's fine, don't worry about it. No, please, I'm not ready. I don't want to dishonor your home. Let me cleanse myself. His story, The Great Divorce, it's a great book. It's a really great book. His story of The Great Divorce is a story about, begins in hell, actually. It is a fantastic bus ride from hell to heaven, a round trip for some, but not for others. So all of these people who are in hell, they can have whatever they want. And so you see these little drawings here. The man in blue is Napoleon, right? I want my rights. It's all about me. He's got this big, beautiful house, and he wants to live by himself. And all these people keep trying to move closer to him, and he's annoyed by it, right? You've got the person who refuses to make a decision about final answers. You've got the artist who is obsessed with living on after his death by living through his art. See, we've got this one guy with a stovepipe hat. It is cruel of you not to need me and to be happy. And we have this woman at the bottom. My son is mine, mine, mine. So there is this one character who loves playing music, and his mom just keeps giving him musical instruments, and he just wants to be left alone to play. And she's on top of him all the time. Well, all these people have an opportunity to get onto this bus and go up to heaven to tour it. Okay. They want to make this tour of heaven. And it's really hard for some of them. There's this great line. There's this angel who shows up and he invites them to come to the mountain. And he has this line, "Will you come with me to the mountains? It will hurt at first until your feet are hardened. Reality is harsh to the feet of shadows, but will you come?" And the idea in the story is that when they step on the grass, it's like stepping on broken glass. And so some of them immediately turn around and get back on the bus. They're like, "Forget it. This is too hard. I'm not doing it." But the idea behind it is that they are insubstantial. They're not hardened to reality. When I talk with my students about it, I liken it to when spring first arrives and we walk outside and our feet hurt because we have not grown calluses. Now, here's the interesting thing, right? The Second Vatican Council defines sin as a diminishment of who we are. And I think that's so good. Classically, evil doesn't exist. Evil is a lack of good or a corruption of good, but it doesn't exist in its own right. So that's what sin is. Sin is, of course, evil. It's lacking something. So what that suggests is that it's hard to be holy. It's not hard. I shouldn't say that. But we can use Dante as another example here. For Dante, like how do you depict paradise where everybody is completely happy? Well, for him, it's almost like exercise. Let's say that we use a cup. How well have I prepared myself for heaven? I'm going to be full no matter what. My cup is going to runneth over. But maybe all I have is a thimble. Maybe you have a goblet, or maybe you have an Olympic-sized swimming pool running over. Regardless, you're full, but how full are you? So there's some effort that goes into it, and part of the effort is also separating ourselves from sin. And that's what we're really talking about when we talk about purgatory. It's learning how to separate ourselves from sin. I've got this quotation at the top there. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, in the end, "Thy will be done." That is actually directing someone toward hell, right? But we turn around. Can we turn around and walk toward God instead? Let me actually go back here. I want to show you one thing here at the bottom. Oh, that's it. Oh, I apologize. Here's the final point not the final, but the point I want to make about purgatory. The purgative element of purgatory is not in hell. It's actually in heaven. And it's learning to let go of those sins. Okay, so let's see if we can come around to that point. Oops. On the left, I have this image of Saints Perpetua and Felicity. And it's because I wanted to tell you about this dream that Felicity has. So she's in prison, and she's a 3rd century or so martyr. She's in prison, and she's going to be executed for being a Christian. And she's receiving all these visions of comfort. And one of the visions she receives is actually of a brother who died when he was only about 7 years old. He died of cancer, and he was malformed, and he died unbaptized. she prayed for him after his death. And in her vision of him, she saw him healed. He did not look malformed. He looked happy. And it was clear to her that he was in heaven. So, that helps to illustrate this idea that we have about how we on earth can help those who have gone ahead. And of course, it's just the idea that death does not separate us. You can look to the book of Revelation and see Christians, martyrs under the altar of God, taking the prayers of those on earth and passing them on to the Father. I've got an image of Cardinal Ratzinger here on the right. And of course, in 2005, Cardinal Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI, and he is now Pope Emeritus. He prefers to be called Father Benedict. But he has a book called Eschatology that had a huge impact on me and how I understand purgatory. He talked about how purgatory is really, it's about the individual. It's not about punishment. We tend to get stuck in that idea. It's about acceptance. If I were suddenly to die, would it be easy for me just to walk with the Lord, or would I be concerned about those who I'm leaving behind, even thinking that they could not do it without me? In one of my favorite sections of that book, he talks about how there's a new awareness of my impact on others. Right? And so I think of that man with the grass stains and the muddy boots who doesn't want to go into the house. What if when I die, I'm able to see the impact of my choices on other people's lives, both for good and for bad? If I am someone who's bound for heaven anyway, then I will probably feel responsible for the evil that I have done to other people. And I might even say to Jesus, I don't deserve to go with you. Jesus will say, I've paid your debt. And I might say, Lord, I can't go with you. Look what I did. I cannot suffer that. I cannot allow it. I need to see it play out. I need to know they're going to be okay. But there's this really great section that I've just brought here completely for you. Purgatory is not, as Tertullian thought, some kind of supra-worldly concentration camp where man is forced to undergo punishment in a more or less arbitrary fashion. Rather, it is the inwardly necessary process of transformation in which a person becomes capable of Christ, capable of God, and thus capable of unity with the whole communion of saints. Simply to look at people with any degree of realism at all is to grasp the necessity of such a process. It does not replace grace by works, but allows the former to achieve its full victory precisely as grace. What actually saves is the full assent of faith. But in most of us, that basic option is buried under a great deal of wood, hay, and straw. Only with difficulty can it peer out from behind the latticework of an egoism we are powerless to pull down with our own hands. Man is the recipient of the divine mercy, yet this does not exonerate him from the need to be transformed. I love this line. Encounter with the Lord is this transformation. It is the fire that burns away our dross and reforms us to be vessels of eternal joy. Purgatory follows by an inner necessity from the idea of penance, the idea of the constant readiness for reform, which marks the forgiven sinner. Frankly, I think that's a lot cooler sounding than what we tend to think purgatory is. So what does the Catechism actually teach about the end of time? Not much. You could go look at it. It is on, let's see, paragraphs 1020 to 1060. So it's just 40 paragraphs. The Catechism talks about the particular judgment that when we die, I will be judged on my own actions and my own love of Christ. Each of us undergoes that. It speaks of hell and of purification and of heaven, which of course we've just talked about. It also mentions the general resurrection and judgment. So these are two things that are worth talking about for a moment. One, a lot of my students don't seem to know that we all resurrect. Like, our belief is that at the end of time, everybody gets his body back. And then we undergo a general judgment. And it's not a rejudging. Rather, it's an openness in front of everybody else about my love of God, my sins, and how I didn't love God. And that sounds terrifying, and it kind of is. But I'll pose this scenario to them. Imagine that you bear a burden of some evil thing that you've done, and you love somebody, and you want to be loved by that person, but you're afraid that you're going to be rejected if you break open your heart to him, that he will repudiate you. What if you broke open your heart to him about this horrible, evil thing that you did? And instead of repudiating you, he says, despite your sins, I love you. I do not condone your actions, but I love you. And then all that fear goes away. That's the general judgment. That's worth waiting for. The Catechism also talks about a new heaven descending to a new earth, where God is all in all, and there's no more need of light because God is our light. This would be Eden at large. And it speaks of the glorified body. We see Christ, the resurrected Christ. He has, like, time doesn't, there's no such thing as physical distance. He can be where he needs to be when he needs to be there. It's called celerity. He can walk through walls. So the physical world is reoriented. It now functions the way that it's supposed to. And by that, what I'm getting at is, Paul tells us in Romans that all of creation groans with the birth pangs of redemption. And go back to those ruptures. I talked about toil. The world no longer works with us the way it's supposed to. In the resurrection, in the new heaven and the new earth, with the glorified body, the world will work with us the way that it's supposed to. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope that I gave you something to think about, maybe a few books to read. Please feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions or would like to talk about anything else. Again, thank you very much. God bless, and goodbye.